reasons, some of the push factors. And the other thing that I wanted to note really quickly is that there are Koreans who live in Brazil and there are Koreans who live in other countries in Europe. But the reason why the majority of Koreans have come to the United States is, of course, because of these geopolitical ties that were really solidified beginning 1945 when the US militarily occupied Korea and divided it, but also especially since the war. I mean, I think that the most recent statistics that I saw, we still have 24,500 US servicemen and women stationed in Korea. So these political and military ties have kind of left the pathway open to immigration between the United States and Korea, which is why you see such a significant number of Koreans coming to the United States. The other push factor was great political insecurity and a lack of political freedom. And this is because right in the 1960s through 1987, Korea experienced 2 military dictatorships. And so that created great censorship and control in terms of politics. And so people seeking political freedom often found themselves in the United States. And some of the pull factors included access to education. And many of the immigrants who came over wanted to create new opportunities for their children. In Korea, the competition to get into university is so steep, and it's an incredibly stressful process that begins when children are really young and carries on into when they get into school. So the tuition rates are also very high. And so the opportunities to attend a very good university in the United States is greater. There are so many more options. And so that becomes a driving force for many of the immigrants to come to the United States. And also there are these imaginings of the United States. And this really happened beginning in 1945, but especially during and after the Korean War, when it was, when these media images of US capitalism, of, you know, everyone drives a Cadillac, these kinds of ideas, everyone has these large homes and all of this land, all of these ideas kind of, I think, built up this idea of what the American dream could be culturally in Korea over the years. And so I just wanted to show you, this is my family. I was born here, but if you look at the picture, that's my mom and dad and my grandma on my dad's side. And that little girl is my older sister. So this was taken in Korea before they came to the United States. And there's my sister very early on when they arrived to the United States. They were in a friend's station wagon when they got here and they first came to Arizona. So my sister was 3 when she came here with my parents. And so they came the summer of 1969. This was post-1965. My parents came exactly for these reasons, to provide a better education for my sister at this point, because I wasn't around yet, and for these economic opportunities. And so I'm going to talk, let's see, a little bit about what Koreans, what kind of employment they went into when they came to the United States. When my parents first came through the preference system, the United States was looking to fill certain niche positions. And some of these were low-skilled labor jobs, and some of them were high-skilled jobs. And my parents came in as low-skilled laborers. My mom actually made dolls. So if you had a special skill or craft, you could come in with a visa, a working visa. But what happened with many of these Koreans who came in, like many immigrants, they couldn't find jobs that were commensurate with their education that they received from their home country. And one of the businesses, or one of the labor areas that Koreans came to fill, was in the form of entrepreneurship. And so if you look at the numbers, there are 50, according to the 2010 census, there are 56,073 Korean entrepreneurs. And these are small business owners. You probably notice in whichever town you live in, you've probably seen a Korean dry cleaners, a Korean liquor store, a Korean, if you're on the East Coast, like a green grocer, a convenience store that also has the deli counter in the middle. So there are these niches became filled by Korean immigrants who were able to build up enough capital to purchase these kinds of stores, often in low-income areas, which I'll get back to when we talk about 1992. And they ended up building up these businesses. And once Koreans owned the business, then they would often, if they were to sell, they would often sell to other Korean store owners. So this person is not a family member, but these are my parents again. And my parents were in the dry cleaning business, and they bought the business from Korean owners. When they sold their businesses, they had 3 dry cleaners. When they sold their businesses, it went always to other Korean store owners. And this is because the information and the knowledge could be passed, right? There's a native language that is spoken. They could share their tips of the trade and how to succeed in these businesses. So Koreans really filled this niche labor market that is an entrepreneurial market. And these businesses, there are thousands, as you can see here, across the United States. And when people look at the median household income of Korean Americans, you often hear that Koreans are doing really well. They attain high levels of education. In terms of the median household income, they have a very, a high median income, annual income. But one of the things that you don't see there are all these hidden factors that don't get accounted for when you come up with that number of the annual household income, which averages 60,000. I'll talk about that more later too. So people think that, okay, Koreans are achieving middle class, but what they don't see, the numbers don't tell the whole story. So the first thing to know about all these entrepreneurs is that they work really long hours. They're often working 7 days a week, often 14 hours a day with no breaks. Another thing that we see very typical of these Korean-owned businesses is that they don't have enough money to hire an employee, which means that they often rely on family labor. And family labor, this is a hidden labor. This is not a paid labor, but this is not accounted for in these statistics. So for example, every summer and throughout my school years in high school and in college, I worked at my parents' dry cleaning business, and they housed me. I got to stay in their home and they fed me, but I wasn't getting paid. I wasn't getting paid to work in the dry cleaners, but I was there for many, many hours growing up. And so these are kind of the hidden factors of Korean employment that are not often seen by the public. Another thing to note about the Korean American community, you've probably seen Korean church vans driving around your town. You've probably seen Korean churches in your neighborhood. And this is connected to a very long history. US foreign missions began in Korea in the 1890s and really continued very strong throughout the 20th century. Here, this photograph that I'm showing you here, it's one of the first Christian churches in Hawaii in the early 1900s. And US missionaries encouraged Koreans to come to Hawaii, which was a US territory at this point. And this becomes the first location of Korean immigration to the United States. Currently, over 80% of Korean Americans are Christian. That is a very large percentage. And there are over 4,000 Korean American churches in the United States. The reason for this is not just a location of spirituality for Koreans, but it's also a place of community. And there are many resources that are offered through these churches. So for example, there are English language courses that are offered for new immigrants. There are training and social adjustment kinds of meetings that are held. Small business owners often meet at churches to help one another out, to give each other information, to help each other along. And so it becomes this location, especially for new immigrants coming to the United States, to find community, but also to find these resources. And for the second generation Korean Americans, the church becomes a location as a really important social and ethnic community building kind of space. You see very strong youth organizations, not just in the churches, you see them on college campuses across the United States. And the Korean church becomes it becomes an anchor for many of these second generation Korean Americans and now third generation Korean Americans who are searching for identity and searching for a community. So I wanted to pause for a second and kind of, I interspersed a few review questions to kind of review just a few of the things that I went over here. So I wanted to ask a couple questions and ask that you write some responses in the chat window. So my two questions are, why was there a notable increase in Korean immigration after 1965? And the second one is to name two push and or pull factors that contributed to Korean immigration post 1965. So I'll give you a minute or so to put up your responses. Great. Great. Someone said Kim's convenience. I'll talk about that in a minute. We'll talk about that at the end. Okay, so Michael, you said the preference system, niche positions, absolutely. These became open to Korean immigrants coming in. Because of immigration law that opened up the law that was in existence in 1924, it really changed in 1965. I should also add that one of the reasons it changed in 1965 is because the US was in the middle of the Cold War, and it looked really bad for America to have these racially restrictive immigration laws. And so they ended up opening up the laws in part to uphold American ideals of democracy on the world stage. If you tell people from around the world that they can't come here, people aren't going to think positively about democracy. And so that's one of the reasons why it changed. That time is a very important and interesting time. Okay, now let me see. Oh, you're all so fast. Okay, let me see if I could back up here. Okay, all right. Okay, right. Okay, so push and pull, change in immigration. Okay, so Nikki says a change in immigration law and education and lack of opportunity in South of Korea, which is also coupled with greater educational opportunities in the United States. Debbie notes the political and economic instability. Kathy talks about the dictators, the militarized dictatorships in Korea. Mandy notes better education and job opportunities. This is great. Kevin notes the low standard of living after the Korean War. Let me see, these are great. Okay. Changes in immigration, Asian immigrants and other citizens. Great. Okay, that's terrific. Thank you. So if we think about the reasons why Koreans came, this is actually really important. Those pull factors were, again, all for an opportunity and to pursue the American dream. And that factors into the things that converge and happen in 1992. So thank you so much for those responses. And I'm going to go back to the presentation. Okay, so back to, sorry, let me go over here for a second. A lot of these businesses, I'm going to focus now on Los Angeles because I'm going to move into what happened in 1992. And a lot of the businesses that were purchased were in low income areas. So Koreans didn't have a lot of capital coming in. A lot of them ended up working different kinds of jobs here to build up their capital. And they also used this rotating credit system called K. And what K is, kind of like, it's a pyramid process where you come in with a certain, a few $1,000s, and by the time it's your turn to come out of that pyramid, that money has built to be about $10,000. Let's just say that is the number. And so this community system used with fellow Korean Americans ended up giving people the seed money that they needed to start a business. The other factor that allowed Korean owners to purchase businesses is that they were able to access loans. Now, they were able to access loans to build up enough money to purchase businesses, but the businesses that they could afford were often in low income areas. And this is why you have such a large cluster of Korean owned businesses in what is now Koreatown, but in South Central Los Angeles, in these areas where the 1992 uprisings occurred. And so you have the capital that was needed to get into these businesses, allowed them to purchase businesses in areas that were predominantly Black and Latino residents. And so these are the kinds of loans that were not available to Black residents because of redlining. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But because of this, you could imagine, right, this tension of these new incoming immigrants who are not as familiar with the history of racism in this country and the history of structural racism in this country. And they're buying up these businesses and pursuing their American dream while there is great racial inequity in the places where they're moving into. So already you could see that there is a tension there. The other tension occurred, of course, because Asians were being held up after World War II. Asians were held up as the model minority. And I think a lot of you are probably familiar with this. But this idea that Asians are quiet, they don't politicize, they don't protest, they kind of pull themselves up from their bootstraps, work really hard to make it in America. And that becomes this model that is then used by sociologists and government officials and different people to say, well, if Asians can do so well, and a lot of them are new immigrants, how come our Black and Latino communities can't do the same? And of course, with a statement like that, it doesn't take into account the decades of structural racism and institutional structures that prevented groups from thriving in these communities. And it didn't take that into account. So Koreans became part of this model minority narrative. Again, they were being lauded for their ability to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And so, and when Koreans did come into this country, they were not fully aware of this narrative, nor were they fully aware of this idea that they were able to access loans whereas other people could not. So there were so many missing pieces to their situation that they weren't fully aware of when they came into these communities. When they did enter these communities, a lot of tensions did arise. There were cultural tensions between the people who lived in these communities and also the Korean store owners who worked there. And the general tension was usually around something like this. Black and Latino residents believed that Koreans were opening up stores that were not good for their communities. A lot of them were liquor stores. A lot of them were convenience stores that sold liquor. And so they said, well, these kinds of businesses aren't really helping our community. The other problem that many of the residents had was that Koreans would have their businesses in these areas, but then would live in the suburbs. So they wouldn't live in these communities, which meant that they probably weren't giving back to these communities. And again, if you think about why Koreans came, they're here for the American dream. They're focused on earning enough money so that they could send their kids to college. And so their focus is elsewhere. And so there were lots of tensions, and people knew that these tensions were arising. So as early as 1983, we have the Black Korean Alliance, and this was a grassroots organization. There were several, but this is one that I'll highlight. And they were in existence right up until the LA Uprisings of 1992. But here's what some of the work that they tried to do. They tried to bridge the gap between the two groups, the Korean store owners and the local community, by facilitating communication in South Central LA. They also heightened cultural awareness programs, and they created this exchange program where they brought residents of the community to Korea. And it was a really successful and vibrant program. Again, they had a shoestring budget because it was a grassroots organization, but it was a really important effort that was being made. The other thing that they did is they created a code of ethics for Korean store owners. And there were some practices that were not common for the Korean store owners. So for example, in Korea, it's not polite when you're exchanging money, it's not polite to touch hands. So a tray is often used where the money's placed on the tray and passed to the person who's shopping in a store, and then the person takes the money in. So there's no contact. A lot of the residents of these neighborhoods felt that Koreans didn't want to touch their Black hands. They felt like this was a racist gesture. And so one of the things that the Black Korean Alliance did is they alerted both sides of these different kinds of cultural differences and created a code of ethics for Korean store owners to follow. So here are here's one organization that kind of tried to address the tensions that were already building in the 80s, but things really came to a head in 1991. As we know, on March 3rd in 1991, 4 white police officers severely beat Rodney King. He's pulled from his car. And this footage, this is, as I think many of us know, this is pre-phone, right? So this is a different kind of viral video, but I would say that this is probably the first viral video where we see a black male, a black or a black female being assaulted. And this footage was caught by a man named George Holliday. He caught it on his camcorder and he sent it to KTLA, which is the local Channel 5 news station here in Los Angeles. And the next day, the video was sent to all media outlets, and the footage of these 4 officers severely assaulting and beating Rodney King is shown across the United States. And at the end of, I didn't want to, the photos were shown all throughout the media, but Rodney King suffered a fractured skull, a fractured cheekbone. He was severely, severely beaten. And this was shown across the country. And just a few weeks later, on March 16th, 1991, a 15-year-old Latasha Harlins is shot and killed by a Korean store owner in South Central LA. And what happened was that Latasha Harlins went to get a bottle of orange juice. She put it in her backpack, and she had apparently put the money for the orange juice on the counter. Sun Ja-do, who was the owner of the Korean store, did not see it and grabbed Latasha's backpack and pulled her back because she thought that she was shoplifting. And so a fight breaks out. Latasha Harlins, I think, hits Sun Ja-do with a chair. Sun Ja-do falls back, and when she comes up, she has a gun in her hand, and it goes off immediately, and it shoots Latasha Harlins in the back of the head, and Latasha dies immediately. This caused great outrage with communities across the United States. There was a nationwide boycott of Korean stores by Black communities across the United States, from South Central to Brooklyn. And so you see this grabbing national attention. And to make things even worse, in November of 1991, Sun Ja-do was charged with voluntary manslaughter, which carries a maximum prison sentence of 16 years. But the trial judge, Judge Carlins, sentenced due to 5 years of probation and 400 hours of community service and a $500 fine. And what this signaled, and there are many details to this case that I don't have time to go into, but one of the reasons why Judge Carlin said that she was lightening the sentence was because Sun Ja-do had purchased the gun illegally, and it was defective. And so they said it had a hair trigger, and that it, like if you just held it wrong, it would go off. And so there were different kinds of cases that were being made. But ultimately, what this showed the Black community is that Black lives were not valued. And now whites were no longer the only perpetrators, and now Korean Americans had stepped into this role of being the perpetrators of this violence. So, this is happening in 1991, and there is this national outcry, and there is even greater tension and friction between the Black and Korean community. And for those of you who teach high school, sometimes I teach Ice Cube's song, Black Korea, to help them. There's some bad words in it, so it's not good for middle school or for elementary school, but I think in high school it's probably fine. But I sometimes have my college students really think through the lyrics to understand the tensions that were existing at this time, and also to think of how rap music became this political outlet, a way to voice the frustrations of the Black community. So that's something that might be a useful source for you. Okay. With the Rodney King, I'll come over here. So flash forward to April of 1992. And April 29th, 1992 was the day that the Rodney King verdict was read. And this trial case, it was supposed to take place in Los Angeles, but then they moved it to Simi Valley, which is predominantly white neighborhood. And so as a result, the juries for the Rodney King case were it was an almost all white jury. And they decided on April 29th that all 4 officers were acquitted of charges. There was a mistrial for one of the officers, Officer Powell, for use of excessive force. But this was an incredibly highly televised case. People were following it. I don't know, I'm sure that we all have memories of it and we remember it in different ways. But, you know, since it's pre-phone, for those of you who were around there or who were too young to remember, this was like, everyone had their eyes on what was going to happen with this case. If you were out running errands, you would find a Best Buy because they would be televising this, the verdict live. So everyone was watching this, and almost immediately, as soon as the verdict was read, the protests and the uprisings began, and people started to storm the LAPD office, and these uprisings last for 6 days. About 4 days into the uprisings, 10,000 National Guard are brought in to quell the fighting. I'm going to actually go forward before we do this. At the end of the 6 days, it's estimated that 63 people died as a result of the activities that happened there. Over 4,000 people were injured. There were over 16,000 arrests, and there was property damage of over $1 billion. And of this $1 billion, $400 million of the damage was sustained by Korean-owned businesses. And of the 3,100 businesses that were burned or looted or destroyed, 2,500 of them were Korean-owned. So I give you this statistic to help us see how it was that Korean-owned businesses were targeted. They were specifically targeted in South Central. This is right around where USC's campus is, actually. It's just a few within a mile or so of the USC campus. And so because of this, on day 2 and day 3 of the uprisings, Koreans organize a peace rally. So on May 1st, they have about 1,000 Korean Americans gather for a peace rally on the corner of Western and Wilshire in Los Angeles. And by day 2, that number has grown to 30,000 people marching, peacefully marching for racial healing and for support of merchants in Koreatown. And when people recall, like Korean Americans will recall what happened when these uprisings began and as they continued. And there were many store owners who said the police didn't come in for 5 days. And this is true. The police were so overwhelmed that they ended up retreating from the city, from the areas where the looting and the arson was taking place. And they ended up in places like Bel Air, like guarding the gates of Bel Air, which is a very wealthy community in Los Angeles. But they were not helping in South Central LA. And many Korean merchants would say, because there was no police, they had no option but to guard their own stores and to protect their life savings that they had saved, up forever to have these businesses. And so I'm going to show you, a short video. This is a longer documentary. It's from a film called Wet Sand. And I'm just going to show you the first 5 minutes of the film. This is an older film, but it shows multiple perspectives of the LA uprisings.
Are we supposed to see a video as well?
Oh, I'm sorry?
We only hear sound.
I'm sorry, Jenny?
We only hear sound. Are we supposed to see a video as well?
Yes. Oh, hold on.
Share.
Let me see.
So share your video screen with us.
Okay. Does that work? Can you see the image?
No.
I think that you need to reshare. So if you click on,
should I stop and then
stop? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I'll stop and then I'll go.
There, it's up now. It's just not running.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll back it up a little bit. Okay. Is that good?
저는 지금도 아들을 일주일에 한 번 꼭 가요. 아들 산소를 간다라기보다 제 마음에 굉장히 거기를 안 갔다 오면은 일을 잘 못해요. 저희 집도 좀 얘기를 잘 안 하는 편이에요. 뭐 이제 꿈을 꿨다든지 그거는 쉐어를 해요. 어저께 밤에 꿈을 꿨는데 애가 뭐 어떻게 해서 했다 그러면 이 꿈을 못 꾼 입장에서는 제 입장 같으면 아, 그래도 나한테도 좀 오지. 또 왜 거기만 갔나?
이맘때만 되면 생각이 더 많이 나죠. 또 이제 점점 이제 멀어지는 것 같고 항상 그렇게 그냥 가슴에 안고 살죠. 지금. 뭐 항상 마음에 뭐 안고 사니까 항상 가슴이 아프죠. 뭐 지금이나 그때나 똑같아요. 심정은. 더 많이 생각이 나요. 이 아이들이 지나가는 거 보면 콧돌에 그러면 뭐 생각이 더 나죠.
제가 라디오를 들으면서 이제 막 흥분하기 시작한 거예요. 저렇게 우리 한국 사람들이 우리가 이제 온 지가 20년이 되니까 20년 동안 우리가 다 저렇게 읽어놓은 게 저렇게 하루아침에 지금 불타고 그러는데 어떻게 저렇게 바라다 보고 있느냐 그러면서 저기 나가서 다 해야 된다는 소리예요. 내가 하나밖에 없는 아들인데 얘들을 저 속으로 내가 보낼 수는 없잖아요. 우리 딸이 엄마 오빠 이상하게 뭐가 어떻게 됐나 봐 그러더니 막 울어요. 어저께 원산 면역에서 있었던 게 에디 같아요. 그래. 한 가닥 제가 희망이 그날 아들이 그 입은 그대로 나갔으면은 청바지에다 하얀 티셔츠를 입고 나갔었거든요. 그런데 그 사진은 보니까 검은색 티셔츠더라고요. 그래서 이게 내 아들이 아니겠지. 저한테는 이제 뭐 정말 지푸레기라도 건지고 싶은 심정에 얼굴은 분명히 내 아들인데 옷이 아니니까 제가 거기를 갔어요. 거기를 그랬더니 갖고 나오는 게 뭘 갖고 나오냐면 우리 아들이 썼던 안경하고 주머니에 20전하고 제가 그 볼펜 하나 있었던 게 있거든요. 볼펜하고 걔가 그 희생당했을 때 가지고 있었던 소지품은 그게 전부였더라고요. 나중에 그 검은 티셔츠가 왜 그렇게 내가 그렇게 보였는 거 아니? 같은 날짜에 LA 타임즈지에는 그게 칼라로 돼가지고 확실하게 나왔던 게 검었던 그 색깔이 모두가 피로 젖어 있는 그거였더라고요.
여호와의 집에 영원히 거하리로다. 아멘.
사회 폭동이 일어나고 점점 흐려져가는 4.29. 정말 4.29 때 좀 굉장했었죠? 우리 정말 10만 인파라고 할 정도로 정말 우리 한국 사람이 하나가 돼가지고 한 목소리가 돼가지고 굉장히 우리 한국 사람이 뭉쳐져 있었어요. 그때는 젖은 모래알을 손에 움켜졌던 것 같아요. 우리가 모래알을 손에 움켜졌을 때 젖어 있을 땐 그래도 움켜져져요. 근데 그게 이제 해가 뜨고 마르고 그래 봐요. 손 5손가락 사이로 다 빠져나가요. 지금 없어요.
And so when we look at this, throughout the rest of this documentary, you hear from different people who were residents in South Central LA, to different store owners, to people who were Los Angeles residents, to the police, and they interview an array of people. But I wanted to highlight, since this is a Korean American focus, one of the things that happened was there was, of course, severe loss and trauma for the Korean American community. And it was a politicizing and galvanizing moment at the same time. I think that what happened in 1992 was a wake up for many Korean Americans to understand that they've entered in on a stage that is not of their own making. Korean Americans came in with this dream, but they arrived on a stage that was full of racial strife and inequity. And they became wedged into the racial landscape that already existed before they came to the United States. And I wanted to show you, let's see. If you remember the footage from, from the Los Angeles Uprisings, you remember seeing images like this, sorry. These were common images that you saw. You saw images of the city burning, you saw residents of these neighborhoods looting, and you saw gun-toting Koreans often on the tops of their stores. And you see that over here in the upper right-hand corner. And when people saw the footage from, whether you were from Los Angeles or from some other place around the country or even around the world, it looked like extreme lawlessness. And the way that the media really portrayed and captured these uprisings was that it was this non-white circus of, vigilantes and looters and arsonists. It really focused on the violence of these uprisings, which they were violent. I will not say, we cannot sugarcoat what happened, but the way that the media proposed or suggested what was happening was that this was a Korean Black problem. This was not a white structural racism problem. And so what these media images did is it alleviated, or it averted this conversation that needed to be had about why there were these tensions that continued to erupt in the city. So, I often teach the 1992 uprisings in the context of the 1965 Watts uprisings, to think about the structural inequalities, the high jobless rates, the lack of a good school system, the lacking of housing for people. There were no structures put in place in these parts of the city that allowed people to live safely. And those are the real reasons as to why these uprisings have occurred. And I think it's really important. It will be important for your students, of course, to understand the 1992 uprisings and the 1965 uprisings, of course, in the context of what's happening today around the most recent police killings. And if we view 1965 and 1992 as the backdrop, we see that the changes that needed to be made earlier have not been made. And there have been some changes. There has been a little bit of reform for the police force, but not nearly enough. And even during the LA uprisings, people said this will happen again. And what we see today is what we saw before. And this is something that I think your students will be very interested in talking about. We just had a teach-in at Cal State Fullerton, and some of the things that we talked about with our students is that what we see happening now and what we see happening in 1992, these are a series of rebellions. These are rational responses to legitimate grievances. This time around, I hear this language so much more, which is very heartening, but there seems to be more clarity about what the protests are really about. They are a response to repeated violence against Black bodies and a condemnation of the systemic attack of Black Americans who have not been given an equal chance to live safely and thrive in this country. And so those are the core reasons as to why all of these tensions erupted. Korean immigrants coming in layered on top of existing tensions and then built upon them. And so I think it's important to contextualize the much longer history behind policing and racial inequity in this country with your students. But what this did for the Korean American community is it really was a political awakening. And you see this in the peace rallies that took place in 1992, but you also see it in the kind of community building efforts that were formed in the wake of 1992. And there are many different organizations, but in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on one organization that is still in operation today. The Korean Immigrant Workers Alliance was formed in the wake of 1992. And initially what this organization did is it assured that Korean entrepreneurs understood all of American labor laws, communicated and gave their workers fair living wages, the proper break times, the supports and the benefits that they needed. Koreatown in the 1980s and in the 1990s, there was a large immigration into Koreatown, and it was primarily from countries in Latin America. So right now, the population of Koreatown, it's 70% Latino, which means that the Korean-owned restaurants that you may have visited, the Korean-owned pre-COVID, the Korean-owned markets, the people who employ or who work at these places are largely Latino laborers. And so what Kiwa did is it created a communication between Koreans and their Latino workers, and they advocated together. And I think one of the reasons why this organization is still in effect and is still really important for Koreatown today is because it built this multilingual, multicultural coalition. So if you look at the picket lines, it's always mixed with, Korean families, Latino families. They have translators who translate between Korean and Spanish so that everyone is able to communicate with one another. Their goal has shifted, given the shifting needs of Koreatown. So their current efforts are for fair housing in Koreatown. Koreatown has become very gentrified over the past decade. And so they're fighting for fair housing for the residents of Koreatown. And so I wanted to give you a couple review questions. And in the interest of time, I think this first one is you'll be able to answer that, but maybe we could focus in the chat window about this question, which is, how did the media portray the 1992 uprisings? Contrary to these media portrayals, what were the systemic causes of the LA uprisings? And maybe we'll just take a few seconds to hear this. Oh gosh, Judy, I'm just reading your chat about your friend's mom who was killed in her store in DC. You're in high school and you couldn't make sense of this. It was such a scary time. My parents owned a dry cleaners in Hacienda Heights at that time. And I just remember calling them. I was a freshman in college and calling them and saying, I don't know what's going on, but you need to close the store. It was a very scary time. I'm so sorry to hear about your mother's friend, Judy. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Right. So the reasons for the uprisings, the killing of Rodney King and Latasha Harlins, and the high publicity around those cases too, contributed. Elizabeth, you say it was shown as it's not our problem, it's their problem. They presented as a problem between Korean and African American communities, April says. Oh, Eunice, I'm so sorry to hear. Let me see. That you knew Eddie. Okay. Oh, and someone was in Korea and there was an effort to support Koreans. Another thing that came out of this is great. Thank you for contributing to the chat window. Another thing that came out of this, it was also it was a political awakening, but it was also an ethnic cultural awakening for Koreans as well. There were these transnational efforts with Koreans in Korea who were trying to send money to support Korean store owners here who were trying to build up their businesses. Another thing that happened after this is that many Korean businesses did not receive support from the city to rebuild, and so they felt abandoned. And for many, this was a disillusionment of the American dream. They came thinking that they could pursue these opportunities, but they realized what the 1992 uprisings did is it made them realize that they were also not being supported. Okay, thank you. Yes, and redlining and the unfair distribution of educational funding, Jessica writes, this is great. Okay, and I'll just end with Michaela. The systemic causes, the poor housing, high jobless rates, all of these things contributed to the uprisings. Okay. Thank you for these. I'll take a look at these again later. So I wanted to move on in the interest of time. I'm going to kind of jump forward a little bit to help us think about who your Korean American students are today. One of the reasons why it's so important, of course, to teach the LA Uprisings is because your students weren't around then, and so they don't have this understanding of what happened. They don't understand the impact that this had on the Korean American community. And so I think it's an important topic for your students, of course, to learn about. But I'm going to jump ahead and take a snapshot of what the Korean American community looks like today. Some of the students that you may have in your classroom, a lot of them may be international students. Again, because of the difficulty of providing college education to students in Korea, the opportunity to bring Korean students here to receive an American education is really important. Another draw for the Korean international students is English language skills. As we know, with this global market and the global economy that we have today, English language skills are very important. And so the thought of bringing Korean children here when they're young has been appealing to many Korean families. And so I tried to find more recent statistics, and there aren't any available yet. But right now, as of 2015, there were over 6,000 Korean international elementary and secondary school students studying in the United States. This number is much greater at the college level. At US colleges and universities in 2015, there are more than 81,000 students studying in the United States. Many of the college students who come to America to study, they become permanent residents upon graduating, and they end up finding employment in the United States. A very large segment of the Korean American population do hold a bachelor's degree. So 33% of Korean Americans have a bachelor's degree compared to 19% of all Americans. This was as of 2015. And a lot of this is because of parental pressure. Of course, if Korean immigrant parents are coming to provide this education for their children, they're going to push them, right, to do well. If you have Korean students in your class, you may notice that there is sometimes some added parental pressure on the children to get the A's and to get the good grades and to study very hard. What many sociologists have found recently is that there is actually a pretty significant dropout rate for Korean American students at the university level. And people are contributing different things to this. The parental pressure that you have at home is you have distance when you're in college, and so you don't have that same kind of constant pressure when you're at college. Some Korean American students are finding a hard time finding community at these colleges, and so this high dropout rate at the university level is usually not something that is publicized or known as much as the fact that many Koreans hold a bachelor's degree. I think that's the focus. And I wanted to close by thinking about what the Korean American community looks like today. 41% of the Korean population in the United States are now US born. So this means we have so many more second generation, third generation Korean Americans. 59% are foreign born mostly in Korea. And of this group, 60% of foreign born Koreans are US citizens. The median annual household income is $60,000, but again, this takes into account second generation, third generation, and first generation Korean Americans. But for that first generation group, of course, this number for entrepreneurs, as we spoke about before, does not include the hidden labor and the long hours. There is still a significant portion of the Korean American population, 12.8%, that are living at or below the poverty level. And this is something that is not often discussed. This is a large number of this 13% are elderly populations who are living in poverty. And so there's a diversity in terms of the economic realities of the Korean American community. Another thing that you'll see today is that there are multi-generational Korean Americans. There are now multiracial Koreans. Again, sociologist studies and statistics show that Koreans are out marrying a lot. So they're marrying they are marrying fellow Koreans, but they're also marrying people who are not in their ethnic and racial group. And so as a result, you have a lot of what they call Hapa kids who identify with biracial and sometimes even more than that, multiracial identities. Of course, we know of the YouTube generation. Korean Americans have found their voice through the platform of YouTube. No one shows us this better than K-pop, right? The use of social media to create fans. And I'm going to link this YouTube and political awareness by talking a little bit as I end about BTS. So I think some of you may have heard about how BTS fans signed up for the Trump rally in Oklahoma on Sunday with false registrations to make it look like a million people were going to be attending, and then they didn't show. And this was a fan-led campaign to push back against Trump, but also they're flooding alt-right websites with BTS videos and BTS photos. And this is a really interesting moment, I think, for K-pop. BTS in particular has been much more vocal about equality. They support LGBTQ communities. This is really big for a Korean group. To come out and support equality and to really make it part of their public platform, which BTS has done. And another thing that I think that's really interesting is that fans are not just passive consumers. Like the fans of BTS have been encouraged to take action. And I think that's something that we're seeing unfold in our current moment. And so I just wanted to end by thinking about the diversity of the Korean American community. When it comes to the first generation of Korean Americans, you have a mixture of immigrants who came who are now older, but also you have this first generation of young students who are here as international students. For second generation Korean Americans like myself, these are for those of us who our parents came to the US after 1965. This is an identity we often call ourselves the 1.5ers, where we speak Korean at home, but we're very Americanized. We speak English elsewhere, but this kind of in-between identity. I think someone had Roy Choi as someone in their background. I forget who it was, but Roy Choi is also someone who often talks about the split identity that he has between his Korean identity and his American one. And we have now third and some fourth generation Korean Americans. Some of them, again, are multiracial. And I've given talks to third graders at this Korean camp that happens in Big Bear. And many of the students, the kids that I meet who, these are grades 3 through 12. Many of them are third generation. Many of them don't know how to speak Korean, but are interested in learning about their Korean heritage. This camp that I have gone to before, they talk about their Korean roots, and this is like a really important awakening for many of them. And so I think that as we teach Korean American students and we teach about Korean history, in particular, I think it's important for Korean youth to understand this history, to raise a consciousness of where they came from, but also where they are headed as part of a community that has grown increasingly diverse and complex and is really multi-layered. And what I hope, like what I think we all hope with teaching, is that our students emerge with a better sense of their history and community and their role in improving conditions, not just for Korean Americans, but for all Americans. So I'll end there. I think I went way over. I had some reflection questions at the end, but I would much rather answer your questions. These are things that you could think about at a later point. But maybe at this point, I don't know if we have time to answer questions.
Yes, we have about 6 minutes before the next program. So there was a question why police did not protect Koreatown.
Yeah.
Other than just they wanted to protect the Bel Air area. Why?
Yeah, there are many on the ground reports of what happened. And the first day of the uprisings, there were people who lived in the community, Korean store owners, but also residents who said the police came into the city and were so overwhelmed by what was happening that they retreated. And so there was an initial effort and then there was a retreat. And so what happened at that point, and then if you listen to interviews of police chiefs and of different officers at the time, one of the things that they say is that it was just too overwhelming and that they felt that they were going to incite more violence by being present. But some people hear that and they think, well, isn't that your job to protect these people? So many people were getting hurt. So many buildings were being lit on fire. You needed to protect these people and not be guarding the gates of Bel Air. And that really brought a lot of, criticism of the LAPD at the time. And it really wasn't until the National Guard was called in that the police came together with the National Guard to end the uprisings.
Yeah, I'm sure the police are scared to death. So in Chicago, during this, at the beginning of the violent protest, about 100 stores were completely ruined. And there were police nearby, but they all went into somebody's office and then they hid there all night while the stores were looted. So that was on CNN, and I was thinking, yeah, they're humans, so they're always scared, but it's their job to protect, but they just ran.
Right.
And then, but then the Chicago police who was hiding in that office, it was, there was a camera, hidden camera. So that's how everybody saw that.
Yeah.
So in LA, it was just the pure, the factors. They were scared to come and meet the rioter, or was it the commander who said, well, Koreatown is not worth for protecting, so you just retreat? So was it a political decision, or was it just an individual human level that they didn't want to go into a dangerous area?
I think it was both, because if you look at footage, there were lots of protesters who showed up at LAPD's headquarters, and they were throwing chairs into the doors, and the police officers were with their battle gear, that shield, I don't know what it's called, but they're ready, but they were not. They were just protecting themselves and making sure that they wouldn't come into the building. And the fear is palpable. I mean, you can understand their fear. People were really outraged at the police. They weren't just outraged at Korean store owners. They were outraged at the police for the brutality. This was about Rodney King. So the police knew that much of the anger and frustration that people had was directed towards the police. So there was definitely that fear, but also at the commanding level, they did command their officers to retreat. And they held them back. And when the officers did arrive in the city, they were told to let the looters continue doing what they were doing, just to make sure people didn't get hurt, but let everything kind of play out. And it's really not until the National Guard was brought in that things were shut down in terms of the arson and the looting. But from the Korean American perspective, many of them felt like, how is this America? You know, aren't the police here to protect me? For the Black and Latino residents who live there, they were like, this is also familiar. We know we know about police brutality. This is not a new story, and we are sick and tired of you know, being dismissed as human beings. And so there were all of these multiple layers, but it goes to the story of structural racism in this country. It's such a long history.
Yeah, in 1992, I remember my friend who's a leader in Korean community, she immediately met with the media, and they discussed about the media portrayal of the problem. And then they said, well, this is going to incite some violence. So at that time, they were very careful, and in Chicago there was no damage to Korean community, but this time it's just so bad. I mean, 100 stores are completely destroyed. We have 1 minute. There is one question about how Koreans feel about out marrying other ethnic.
Okay. I think it depends. There are still a lot of Korean parents. Someone mentioned Kim's Convenience, which is a fantastic show, by the way, and that takes place in Toronto. So it's a Korean Canadian family who owns a convenience store, and then you see, I know it's just TV, and it's, you know, it's all scripted, but you know, you see kind of like the typical Korean parents who are like, you're going to marry a nice Christian Korean boy, and that is, you know, their goal for their daughter. And so that is, you know, stereotypes come from someplace. And I think that there are a lot of, you know, Korean first generation parents who still really would like to see their children marry someone who is Korean, someone who is, you know, who shares that racial and ethnic background with them. And so it varies. I still think there are a lot of parents who really want that for their kids. I think that their kids are often they're now Americanized, right? So they're, you know, about independence and making choices on their own. And so I do see, like, just, you know, myself, I married someone who's Mexican American. My parents were totally fine with it, but my parents, I don't think, are representative of all Korean parents. But you definitely see, you know, multiracial families with, you know, Korean children, with Korean mixed race children. You see that much more frequently now. But I will say that there is still a very large segment of the Korean population that really is still pushing for their kids to marry Korean.